Okay, thank you guys for joining us for our first monthly education. I am Amber Parkinson. I am the practice manager and wellness coordinator for Edge Counseling and Wellness. And so thank you so much for hopping on. We will be recording this today, and then this will be on our YouTube channel for you to go back and watch. And so I will try to remember to send out an email to everyone that did sign up so that I can give you that specific link, but otherwise you can just search on Edge Counseling and Wellness and it should live there. So our next monthly education session, if you are wanting to join that as well, is going to be in the month of October with Olivia, and that is going to be on EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Okay.
It took me a long time to memorize that whole acronym. So I'm really proud of myself for memorizing that and saying it off the cuff. But that will be next month. And if you are not familiar with that, that's a great one to jump on and learn about as well. And so if you are interested, you can certainly email me and let me know, and I can give you the link for that. But with no further ado, I will introduce Ashley. You can tell us a little bit about yourself, and then you can start off with a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Amber. I think before I forget it, I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so I am Ashley McMurtry. I am a licensed professional counselor. I have my master's in clinical mental health counseling. I got that from Bradley University. I did my internship for a year at OSF Behavioral Health. I had an outpatient caseload there. I also worked with the partial hospitalization program. And then I've been working in private practice here at Edge Counseling and Wellness for just over 2 years. And today I'm really excited to share about one of my very favorite topics. One thing we should mention too before we get into it is that this is an educational group. It is not group therapy. If you're interested in group therapy, we would recommend you check into our website. We do offer groups from time to time. But for today, I'm just going to be imparting some information to you. So what we're going to do is talk about something that I have grown to have a lot of passion for. This information is based on training that I received, but also on my own clinical experience with a specific type of therapy called internal family systems. Internal family systems is kind of the lengthier version of the theory of the type of therapy. It's also called IFS at times, or parts work. You'll probably hear me use parts work more often. That's just the quicker, easier way to refer to it, but please know that it all means the same thing. So if you're not familiar with IFS, if you're not familiar with parts work, like I mentioned, it's a type of therapy, and it offers people the opportunity to do a lot of really cool things, namely to identify and understand different, what we call parts of themselves, of yourself. This might feel like kind of weird language, but bear with me because it's actually a really common way for all of us to talk about ourselves. You might notice you say things like, well, part of me feels this and part of me feels that. Part of me wants this, part of me wants that. So it kind of plays with that idea, and you get to know the different parts of you on a very deep level. So not only do you identify and understand different parts of yourself, you also identify parts' relationships with one another. This is where the idea of a family system comes into play. More to be said on that later. And basically what you want to do is learn what it's like to experience when parts are and are not activated in you. You develop skills to promote more compassionate self-talk, and you also learn how to heal from what is thought to be a natural source that we all inherently possess. So as we move forward, I would like for all of you to note that this is just a theory. Okay, so you're encouraged to be open to the concepts. By the end of it, though, take home whatever makes sense to you and leave out the rest. So how do you actually use IFS? What can you do with it? IFS has a lot of research backing it up. In the grand scheme of therapy, it's a relatively new form of therapy, but there is continuous research going on, and there's already a lot that exists out there to support that it is useful for a variety of populations and mental health disorders. And one piece of research that I found to be particularly interesting is that some studies show that the client therapist physiology flow together in the process of IFS. So they've basically done studies where they will measure things like your heart rate, your respiration, your skin temperature, and they compared a client and a therapist while they were in a session and found that they more or less lined up. So that's really cool to think that through this version of therapy, the client and the counselor are in tune with each other at a physiological level. I do believe, and don't quote me on this, but I do believe they might have measured brainwave activity as well and found a similar finding. So your brains are operating at a similar level as well. Now, my own personal practice, I have treated a lot of different concerns using this model of therapy, including but not limited to self-esteem, interpersonal conflict, anxiety, trauma, and decision making. And I've seen that this can be very, very successful for all of these concerns and more. I cannot say enough positive things about it. So I think it's important to give some credit to the guy who developed IFS. That would be Dr. Richard Schwartz. And pertinently, he's a family therapist. He's also a researcher, speaker, author, and academic. His story is actually really cool because at first he didn't really believe in focusing too much on the past. He was very present-centered, future-oriented, which I can actually relate to. However, as he developed this form of therapy, he began to see that there is a place for the past. There is a way to make the past useful in the therapy setting. And he also used his expertise as a family therapist to develop this idea that not only do we have these external families that we interact with in the world, but we also have internal families, giving rise to the name, internal family system. So his background as a family therapist helped him to conceptualize this idea of internal family. And he observed that people often refer to quote unquote parts of themselves that interact in systematic ways for basically all people. So again, this idea of part of myself might seem a little bit odd at first, but when you really think about it, we use this language pretty frequently. And not only did he find that there appears to be existence of parts within ourselves that interact with each other, but he found that we ourselves can build relationships with the part, and that's what helps us to feel safe enough to heal, helps your parts feel safe enough to relax and heal. That might seem a little bit abstract right now. I will get more specific about that moving forward. But basically what you should know is that there's this idea, there's parts of us that interact and we can build relationships with them. So the IFS experience is a very dynamic one. It basically values this intentional awareness of our internal world. So when I say internal world, I'm referring to thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, and it's intended to be experiential rather than cognitive. So it often incorporates meditative practices. I have definitely found meditation to be an invaluable tool with this type of work. Helps people kind of put their guard down and lay into the process rather than trying to think of responses. So when the therapist asks a question to the client, they're designed to be felt and instinctive, not so much thought of. So we might use the language in a therapy session, the client says, well, I think this part of me is anxious, or I think this part of me is afraid of what's going to happen tomorrow. I would maybe say to the client, okay, let's ask your thinking part to step back here and see if the answer is still the same. The interesting thing about doing therapy this way is that it can become this really imaginative, creative experience for some people. It certainly does not have to be in order to be effective. I personally really enjoy that aspect of it. And I find that clients do too. It turns something that can be very daunting for people. So the therapy process can be scary, especially if you're talking about things you're afraid of or trauma. It makes those things more fun and a little more playful. You're still taking it seriously, but you're adding this layer of creativity to it. And at times, I've definitely experienced this as well. The process of IFS may result in experiences that can be described as spiritual. And when I say spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious. I mean a connection to something greater than oneself. So that's kind of one of the components of healing IFS offers, is you're not only finding this internal awareness, this internal source of peace and healing, you're also relating to the outside world in a very different way. So, all that being said, if you were to engage in an IFS therapy session, what would that look like? Basically, there is a sequence of events that you follow. There's kind of a structure to it, but a flexible structure. Initially, you're going to start off with identifying and describing parts of yourself. So the therapist is going to help you do that. You might come in with an idea of a part of yourself. You might use parts language. So again, part of me feels this, part of me feels that, which you can branch off of. And there's also different kinds of, again, meditative exercise that you can use, where maybe you imagine different versions of you sitting around a table in a room, and you get curious about each one individually. It usually works best if you start with just one part and get to know it start to finish so that it feels fully seen. So in the process of interviewing that part, you're going to get to know what's its role, what is it trying to do, what might it be afraid of, what might it need. And basically through the process of doing this, for one, you're getting self-understanding, but for another, you're helping your parts to feel more comfortable with the prospect of approaching really difficult topics, so potentially trauma. And then once your parts feel like they are open, once they feel like they can, at the very least, take a risk in, for a few moments, exploring those difficult things, you're granted the opportunity to then process difficult life experiences in a way that feels a lot more comfortable for your system, because you're not diving right in. Instead, all of you says, okay, I can try this, I can do it. While you're doing this, you're also developing trusting relationships between you and your parts. That's something I'll speak to more in a moment as well. And if you can do that, you tune into that natural capacity for healing that I've been speaking about. Okay. So to get more specific here, there are several different major concepts that are really important to understand in order to fully understand IFS. This is something that can get a little bit complicated, so bear with me. There's so much more I could go on to say about this, but for right now, if anything, I'd like for you guys to understand the idea that our minds are multiple. There are different types of parts. And then these last three concepts, blending, burdens, and self, refer to what it means to hold on to pain and what it means to release the pain. So first we have multiplicity of the mind. This is basically the idea that we have many sub-personalities, which seems maybe a bit weird in our culture, but in a lot of other Eastern cultures, this philosophy is actually very common. And I think a really good way that we can conceptualize this is thinking about the Inside Out movies. These are wonderful movies. I think they're amazing demonstrations of parts. A lot of the experts in the field have agreed. So I won't give any spoilers away here if you haven't seen the movies. And if you haven't seen the movies, I definitely recommend that you do. But basically, in the movie, we have all these different characters that represent different emotions. So I have them pictured here. Orange one's anxiety, green is envy, the yellow is joy, and so on. And the thing about the movies is that they're very emotion-centered. So these characters represent primarily the emotion. One difference between this movie and how parts are conceptualized is that parts are much greater than the emotion. So parts are going to have a lot of different emotions. They're also going to have their own thoughts and perspectives. So again, to this point of subpersonality, a part is considered kind of its own little person. And that's the way that I work with clients a lot of times too, is okay, let's imagine that you had some version of yourself that you could look at that was its own person. How would you describe what that person is like? And we really draw out the detail here. So this can include, maybe you do have an image in mind for them. Maybe you do have a name that you want to give them. But most importantly, what would this version of you say? What does it believe? What kinds of things does it feel most of the time? So all that to be said, Inside Out movies is a good kind of starting point to give you an idea of what we're talking about, all these different versions of you in your head, but they are more dynamic than just the emotion. A couple important things that you should understand about parts as well is, for one, they are considered to be inherently good. Dr. Schwartz wrote an amazing book called No Bad Parts. I recently led a group on it, and he does a really good job outlining here that no part is inherently bad. What they do might not always serve you, but the part itself is very good. And the part is not a result of trauma. So it's not born out of some sort of traumatic experience. Instead, the part is something that is inherent to you. It is something that you are born with. Now, the parts might evolve over time. They might take on different roles. They might develop new fears. So the part may not act exactly as it did when you were born, but it has always existed within you. Similar to you, right? You're born with certain characteristics, certain traits, which remain relatively stable over time, but based on your life experiences, your self-expression, your behavior might change a little bit. Okay? So they're not bad, not born from trauma. So from here, I'd like to outline the two basic types of parts, which would be exiles and protectors. Exiles are what you might refer to as inner children. I think the word inner child is becoming more and more commonplace to use in everyday language, and I love that. You'll notice that here I've used the plural inner children, and that's because all of your parts are considered to be younger than you. Under the IFS paradigm, you have multiple inner children, and they're delightful, playful, creative, trusting, innocent until they are wounded. So again, to this point that you're born with them. You're born with all these parts that have these lovely qualities that simply want to exist. But unfortunately, some of them throughout your life are wounded in some way, emotionally or mentally wounded. When they are wounded, they kind of become what you might think of as frozen in time. Other parts see them as frozen in time at the point of wounding. They carry whatever wound has happened. They're highly sensitive because of that. I mean, think about it. You have this version of you on the inside that's like a child that has been hurt in some way, and it's being forced to carry that hurt so that nobody else does. They're often thought of as bad. They're often thought of as synonymous with the wound, when in fact they're the victim. Because they're considered bad, because they have been wounded, they tend to hide themselves away, or they are pushed away by protectors. Hence the name exile. So they're kind of exiled into their own dark place where they're forced to hold on to that hurt. Protectors are the parts of you that want to hide and protect your exiled parts against further wounding. So they know that the exiles exist. They usually don't like them, or maybe they do, but they're afraid of hurting them further. In any case, they try and push the exiles out of consciousness. They don't want to have to deal with them. Now remember, I said parts are inherently good. These parts might be starting to feel bad. What I want you guys to understand is that the protectors are positively intentioned. And the thing is, at some point, they have helped you. They have helped you using their go-to method, but they eventually outlive that helpfulness. When you think about it, the protector is existing to prevent pain. That's where the positive intention comes from. It doesn't want you to have to deal with hurt. It doesn't want the exile to be prodded. It doesn't want that wound to be reopened. So it tries to get rid of that in whatever way it knows how. So this seems really big, a little bit confusing, but I think we can all relate to one of the last items that I have here, which is the roles protectors might take. And this is not an extensive list, but it's a good start. Protectors might take on the role of people-pleasing, perfectionism, criticism, judgment, caretaking, and then over anything. So oversleeping, overworking, overeating, even to the point of maybe substance abuse and self-harm. Now, when you think of yourself in these terms, especially the really extreme here, so if you think of an extreme behavior like self-harm, I love that Parts Work depathologizes those behaviors. Self-harm is the alternative to maybe death for some people. A protector who is self-harming is trying to protect you, is trying to protect your life in a way. So once you begin to look at those behaviors in this way, it's not that you're excusing them, not saying that you want to continue them forever, but it does give you this level of self-understanding that even some of my darkest thoughts, even some of my least desirable behaviors have a positively intended, they're positively intentioned. So all that being said, I'd like to explain a little further how these parts kind of work together. This takes us to the idea of burdens or burdening. So you remember when I was describing exiles, I described this wound that they carry, this hurt that they carry. Same thing as a burden. So you can use these words interchangeably, burdens, wound, or hurt. Protectors often try to prevent or react to them, while exiles carry them. And interestingly, remember before, I was talking about Parts Work can have this really cool effect that makes you feel more connected to other people. When you understand your burden more fully, you also recognize your own burdens in other people, which is pretty spectacular when you think about it. So maybe I have a tendency to people please. Once I fully recognize and understand that, I become more aware of people who might also struggle with it. The ultimate goal of IFS then is unburdening, which is alleviating the burden. It's a healing process where burdens are released so that parts can relax and work more effectively. And this is so important. Through unburdening, you are not trying to get rid of any part. Instead, you're trying to change its role. It can be helpful to you. You want to allow it to be helpful to you rather than allowing it to be unhelpful to you. And when parts are unburdened, they immediately transform. They have more connection to and trust with your true self, and that's capitalized for a reason. I'll talk about self at the end. We get a better sense of who we really are, and we feel connected to others and even something greater than ourselves. So again, that common humanity, that connectedness is prevalent both in the way we experience our hurt and in the way that we experience our healing. Okay. So now let's talk for a moment about blending. Blending describes this phenomenon where some part of you, whether that's an exile or a protector, usually a protector, takes over. So again, let's relate this to Inside Out a little bit. If you've seen the movies, then you're familiar with this kind of control panel that I have pictured here. A part gets activated, or in the movie, it would be an emotion is activated, and it takes over the control panel. I also call this getting in the driver's seat. It takes over the steering wheel, and it drives you wherever it feels like you need to go to get away from the pain. When blending happens, it can be a pretty consistent thing. It can be something that happens more so when you're triggered. So when does it happen? Most of the time for some parts, when triggered for other parts. It really just depends, and there's no way of knowing until you get to know the part. Now, when that blending occurs, when your part swoops in and takes over the control panel, your true self, who you really are at your core, becomes obscured. You're probably going to feel overwhelmed. And you're going to lose that connectedness that we've been talking about. You're not going to feel as compassionate, connected, or understanding towards others. In this state, parts do not trust anyone but themselves. They think they know best. That's why they've taken over. They believe you to be young and powerless, and they respond to perceived danger the very best way that they know how. Now, this piece about parts believing you to be young and powerless is really interesting. Through parts work, one of the questions I commonly ask clients when you're in the process of getting to know a part is, how old does that part think you are? And it's really amazing to find that 9 times out of 10, the part believes that you are much younger than you really are, because it's stuck in time, right? It's stuck in that time when you were burdened. And then you might ask the client, well, tell the part how old you truly are. And it's just amazing to see that the part is truly baffled and doesn't believe it. So throughout parts work, you try to kind of mend that gap and develop that self-understanding. Ultimately, if you can do that, if you can get everybody on the same page, you're going to have a lot better time with unblending. So unblending refers to taking the part out of the driver's seat, having them step away from the control panel. Okay. So then this takes us to the idea of self. I've seen this word pop up a few times. Self is believed to be who we naturally are at our core. We all have a self, and all of our selves are actually very similar to one another. It's considered to be this undamaged agent of healing that intuitively responds to life with what Dr. Schwartz calls the 8 C's, which are 8 words. They all start with C and represent the type of healing that self allows. They include things like compassion, calm, courage, curiosity, etc. Now, people can describe self in a lot of different ways. People experience self in a lot of different ways. The common thread that a lot of people will report when they're in self is this felt sense of warmth, tingling, and openness. Openness is the big word here. We're talking about parts coming, taking over, blending, getting control of that control panel. If you want the part to stop, it needs to step back and invite space. So when we try to build trust between the part and ourself, when we try to improve our relationship with self, we're often going to ask parts, whether that's a protector or an exile, for a little bit of space. You might ask it, make yourself comfortable. Go ahead and sit in a waiting room. That's a nice visual for people. And more often than not, if the part feels safe enough, it will do that. And the client will experience this warmth, this tingling, this openness, which is really, really beautiful. So ultimately, self can be used to respond to exiled and protective parts when they blend, requires that unblending, that asking for space in order to access, and it results in a noticeable shift in perception of parts. So you're no longer in the part, operating from the part, but instead you're with the part. You're having a conversation. You're getting to know it. You're getting to know yourself. And if you can't invite this openness, if you can separate from parts and be in that true self, again, you'll recognize and respond well to the hurt of others. So not only do you have more compassion for yourself internally, you have more compassion for other people. So you can see how powerful of a concept this is, and how desirable this can be. I have seen this work for sure. It is a long process. Don't get me wrong. It's a long, at times complicated process, but I totally believe that it is possible. So all of that being said, if there's anything I want you to take away from today, it would be these few things. IFS is also called parts work. This is a form of therapy where we observe internal experiences, and we may be thought to have several sub-personalities that within parts work are referred to as, of course, parts. These parts have relationships with each other. There are 2 different types of parts, exiles and protectors. Exiles hold our burdens and are hidden away. Protectors prevent and react when burdens are exposed. And burdens refer to the wounds that our exiles carry, the ways that we have been mentally and emotionally hurt before. Blending refers to when parts of us take over the control panel. And self is our internal source of healing. Self is not a part of us, but who we are at our core. We can access this version of us at any time, as long as parts are willing to unblend. It is obscured then when our parts do blend. Can be described similar ways for all people, that warm openness tingling, but of course that can vary a little bit. Okay. So I have thrown a lot at you. IFS is very complicated. Like I mentioned before, I could go on and into this, but if anybody has any questions at this time, I'd be happy to take them.
So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I did want to mention, Ashley, you mentioned earlier regarding meditation and how that is super helpful. I do have your parts meditation on YouTube. So I'm actually going to put that in the chat if anyone's interested in checking that out. And then also, I don't know if you have like a meaningful like story or something that you've seen like be evolved with this work, either with one of your clients or a story that you've like heard about that is just that you would be open to sharing.
Yeah, great one. Of course, I do need to be mindful of confidentiality. Though I do have somebody I've been working with probably about a year now, and I have seen just the most amazing progress. I had tried all kinds of different strategies with them. IFS isn't the only modality that I used, so I am partial to it. We had tried, CBT, DBT, so cognitive strategies, emotionally centered strategies to try and focus on her perfectionism, on her people pleasing. And it wasn't until we started using parts work that she actually began to tackle these things. And the most amazing thing about it, I mean, we had some really lovely conversation about her parts. She is very imaginative, has names for them, everything like that. But it wasn't until parts work that she started really kind of taking the work home. And suddenly I'm having her come back into session and report to me, at work, maybe she got some feedback, but it didn't bother her the way that it once did. She's more confident. She's doing more of the things that she enjoys doing simply for the sake of enjoying them. And from there, we actually got into some trauma work. There was trauma that she didn't even remember that she had. And now it's kind of coming to the surface. And I think the most remarkable thing about that is you always start with protectors before you go to the exile. And with her protectors, there was so much resistance towards talking about the trauma. It was just the most terrifying thing you could imagine. And now all of her parts are okay with it. And they've actually, she has completed an unburdening. That's the other thing I should mention. Unburdening can happen multiple times for multiple exiles. She's successfully completed an unburdening for one of her exiles. This exile is now incorporated in with the rest of the parts and seen as just as good and valuable as the rest of them. And now we're working on a second unburdening. And having done that once, it makes doing it a second time so much, it feels so much safer, I think, to her. So in so many words, without giving away too many details, I would say that is kind of my prime example, my winning case right now.
Hi there, I have a question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley. It's great. I met Dr. Schwartz like 10 years ago, I think, but I don't remember much from it in a workshop. I'm a student at Bradley in the counseling program, and I love that and I have some experience facilitating psychodrama on weekend retreats for men. And like without even knowing it, we were doing a lot of this parts work, right? It like naturally, because the participants just are creative and they bring out parts of themselves and they talk to them, in a room. So I guess my question is that you said that this is experiential, and I think it is, yes. So like, other than like what sort of tools and props and things you might do with bodies and chairs and things like that, because it's not how you think about the parts, it's how you experience the parts, right?
Yeah, great question. So I personally don't have experience with psychodrama. I think it's really interesting. So it's not necessarily experiential in the way psychodrama is, that you would maybe be standing up and incorporating movement. It's more experiential in an embodiment kind of way. So you're having the client become really familiar with what they're experiencing in their body, not just the thoughts and feelings, but also what are they sensing. And that's the incredible thing, is people will say, oh, my arm got cold, or my shoulder is tight. And they can very specifically pinpoint, which then helps them later detect, oh, I have a cold arm right now. I think this part is with me. But also, in any therapy, you don't want to lead the client. You want the client to lead you. And the thing I love about this is it helps the questions come so naturally, because you're simply being curious. You ask the client about their part, they give you an answer. Based on the answer they give you, I wonder. And you just get to know more and more. And there's a specific set of questions that you ask to do that. But it also, I think, as a clinician, it's helpful because you yourself just want to know more, and the client is the one that has the answers.
And then, thank you. One more question related. You said it's more common that the protector, right, takes over for the exile. Can you give a couple examples where the exile, trumps the protector?
Sure. Yeah. So if an exile were to come out, the exile is usually highly emotional. So where a protector, let's say everyone has an inner critic, that's one of your most common protectors, where the critic might come out and start judging you. They'll hear the client maybe being really mean to themselves or questioning everything that they're saying. An exile coming out would look more like the shame. So oftentimes the critic is giving you judgment so that you do better, so that you aren't put in a position to experience shame. The exile would be a part of you that comes out, and usually it'll be very tearful, or the voice will raise. It's basically this outburst of emotion that's usually shoved down. Memories too. Unburdening, a big part of unburdening is you're recalling memories and kind of reprocessing those, similar to EMDR. Usually if you're working with an exile, there will be a flood of memories that comes out. Good question.
Ashley, I only had one other question. How would you see this used in a very practical way, right? On an everyday basis? Let's just say, like in a workplace, you are in a meeting and you're getting frustrated by something another coworker is saying. How would you see that playing out and using that in your everyday life?
That's a great question. So I would recommend, I hate to answer this, I'm trying to keep it simple, but I hate to answer it with 3 things. It's the easiest way though. Gratitude, validation, and space. So the part comes out and maybe you're really frustrated at work, right? And your immediate response is, oh, I need to get out of here. This is ridiculous. I hate this. Instead of fighting against that or falling into it, you would tell yourself, okay, thank you to this part. Maybe you don't know this part yet. Thank you to whoever you are for letting yourself be known. This is really frustrating. I don't love being here. So there's the gratitude and the validation. In what way can it make sense for you? Despite that, can you give me just a moment? Can you step back and give me some space? And 9 times out of 10, that's all it takes for this part to subside, because it's ready to have a break. It's working a lot of the time. And once it gets that break, self is just there. If you're not blended, if the part isn't taking over, the only thing left is self. And from there, people often find they're a lot more patient, they're a lot more confident, what have you. So yeah, gratitude, validation, and space.
Love that. Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions before we close the meeting today? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you, Ashley, for your presentation today. Really appreciate that. This will live on our YouTube channel. And for those of you that did, let me know that you wanted to come to the meeting. I'll send you that link directly. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. And if you want to join that next month, October session in EMDR with Olivia, let me know and I'd be happy to get you the link to that. So thank you. Have a great day.
Guys.
Thank you.